take a seat.
After you.
You want me to go first?
I do.
I'm not a guinea pig. Well, as you know, my name is Dennis Wildnauer. I'm formally trained as a horticulturist, but at some point in my life I decided to put down the trowel and I picked up a hammer and started making hand-hammered aluminum items. I began, the interest in them began as a collectible. I started collecting old pieces that were becoming collectible, and I enjoyed always liked metal work, but I enjoyed the designs on them, and it was just sort of an activity of something to occupy my time. And in the collecting of them, I did some research where I was trying to find out about who actually made them. A lot of the producers of the aluminum are relatively minor people who did it as a hobby, or they did it as a small business. Most of them in Pennsylvania, because it began in western Pennsylvania. It was the genesis of it. I won't bore you with all that story, but in the collecting of the aluminum, I started doing the research, and I found a group of the dies. Now on the bottom here is an actual die. It's a big block of steel that has the design engraved into it, literally engraved with a hammer and a chisel by an artist. I bought these dies, not really having the intention of making things with them, but I thought, well, I should buy them just to perhaps preserve them, because they're rare. They're big blocks of steel that like to rust if you don't take care of them. And if you're moving around, no one wanted to keep them, and they ended up in scrap yards. So I bought these dies, and one thing led to another. I decided I had to try to make something. So I didn't bring that piece today. That one's not very good. But what I did bring was some, in the case of the die, this was engraved by a man named Stewart. He was a reverend. He engraved the dies, sold the aluminum to raise money for various parishes that he was involved with over his lifetime. And the piece on the end there is actually one of his, probably made somewhere in the 1940s, and from that same die. And the one in the middle is one that I actually made from the die. So you get to see my interpretation of the design. One of the interesting things about the design is you can see the die, the piece that you make from the die is reversed. The image will be reversed on it. In the case of a flower or a dog, it doesn't really matter, but if I had letters or numbers on there, well, then it becomes more important, obviously. So those were all made from that die. I have other pieces here these were all actually made from Stewart dies. And a daisy. This is his daisy here. This is my daisy interpretation of it. The one on the end is a dogwood that he made, and the bowl is one that I made as well. And the bread tray is also from the same design. So you can use the design, you can use the different portions of it to make different pieces. But this is all done completely by hand. The piece would be put on the die, be clamped down, and then I literally hammer from behind, pushing it into the die. And if you look on the back, you can see all the hammer marks. That's from me hitting it, pushing it into the design. And it's not a tap kind of a thing. It's like that. Then that's all done flat. Then I would edge it, clean the edges, put a little marking on the edge. Different pieces that I have different kinds of edging on them. Then it's formed over a wooden form to get the shape, depending on what it is that you're making. And then it's polished. Now in my case, I make everything completely by hand. I don't use any machinery other than a drill if I'm going to drill something. But there's only 3 or 4 people in the country who are still doing this, and I'm probably the only one who does it completely by hand. Most of the others have pneumatic hammers that, you know, basically like a jackhammer that you guide, that is suspended from the ceiling, and they kind of push it in, you know, like that. So I haven't succumbed to that process yet, so as long as I can, as long as my shoulder holds out, I will continue to make it this way, and I enjoy it. And what else can I tell you? Any questions?
Is that hot when you're doing it?
No, it's a good question. No, it's actually done cold. It's the aluminum itself is the particular grade of aluminum is called 1100-0. It's completely dead soft. It's still very soft, but it's very strong. If you were to place a piece of, and very sensitive, if you were to place a piece of just a hair on top of that die, and you put the aluminum on it and I hammered from behind, you would actually see the line of the hair on the aluminum. But it's still very strong. That's why they make airplanes out of it. Very light but strong.
How many dies do you have, and have you ever made any of your own dies?
I have probably 80, maybe 90 different dies. I've never made an entire die myself. I've worked on a couple that needed help, that were sort of corroded, had needed some cleaning up and re-engraving. I've done that, and I've had a couple of dies. Actually, the other case in the other room is mine as well. Those are the pieces on the left side there. There's a snowman, there's a bird feeder, and some Christmas trees. Those are made from a die that I had somebody else engrave. The die engraving is a very sort of a dying art in itself. Not many people do it.
So why have you refused to take the new technology?
It would take the fun out of it for me. One thing, I mean, if I was starting out in this and I wanted to make a life out of it, I probably would. But I'm at the tail end of the production years, so I don't think I will ever do that. Nothing against it. Any other questions?
Dennis, could you share a little bit about the process of binding the vintage dyes that you use? How preservation is really a big part of that
Good
process.
question. The first dyes that I found, there was a man named Mansfeld, and I had some pieces that were marked H. Mansfeld, and since most of the producers of this aluminum were from Pennsylvania, I had to make an assumption that he was probably from Pennsylvania, and more than likely probably from Western Pennsylvania, because that was sort of the boiling pot of aluminum production was. So I did some cold calls and looking in the phone books under Mansfeld, which wasn't a very common name. If his name would have been Smith, I would have been in trouble. But it was Mansfeld. I didn't find that many names, and in fact, the first one that I called, I ended up calling his son, he did always a little leery of people calling, but this was back in 1998, I think, 97, 98. And I asked him about his father, the aluminum, and was that his father? And he said yes. And he told me all about him. And then he actually mentioned that his father had sold the dies to a cousin, and that cousin passed away a number of years ago. But his son, he thinks his son still had them. So he said, if you want to, I'll find out if he's interested in talking to you about them. And I said, yes, I would be very interested in talking to him about the dies. And he gave me his phone number, and then I talked to him, and he did in fact have them. The funny part of the story is that they're steel, and if they get wet, if they get in high humidity, they just begin to rust, and that image is gone. It'll just become big holes. But the way to preserve them is to put oil on them, and to keep it like just a general motor oil on them, and they won't rust. Well, this man that I talked to, his father, who had these dies all those years, did this. They covered them with oil all the time, and he, being the good son that he was, once his father passed away, kept doing the same thing. He just kept oil on them. Now, him or his father ever used them, and but he just kept oiling them because that's what his father did, and he knew they had to be oiled to keep them preserved. So that's what he did, and they were in remarkable condition. Some of them weren't, but I bought them all. He had some forms, wooden forms for making. Actually, this is from one of his forms. It's wood and has that shape to it. Tools, hammers, a lot of different things. So I was very fortunate that it happened that easy the first time. After that, it wasn't so easy. But I did find some other groupings, and each one has their own little story, but it was fun. It was an adventure just to find them.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you.